You know, the funny thing about grief is that it makes the world quiet. Terribly, deafeningly quiet. After I lost my Arthur in the fall of '74. The silence in our little suburban house was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It was a physical presence. It sat in his worn, green armchair. It lay on his side of the bed. It was in the garage, where his tools hung on the pegboard, clean and orderly, just waiting for a weekend project that would never come. This wasn't some grand, Gothic mansion on a windswept moor. This was a 3-bedroom ranch house on a cul-de-sac in Ohio. The kind of place where you hear lawnmowers on a Saturday morning and the jingle of the ice cream truck in the summer. It was the safest, most normal place in the world. And that just made the silence worse. Arthur was the sound of my life. The low rumble of his voice reading the newspaper. The tuneless whistling as he fixed a leaky faucet. The sound of his heavy work boots on the linoleum floor. Without him, the house was just a box of air. My name is Helen. And I was 48 years old when my husband of 26 years had a heart attack while mowing that very lawn. One minute he was there, a familiar silhouette against the afternoon sun, and the next, he was gone. The first few months are a blur of casseroles from neighbors and sympathetic tilted heads from the ladies at the grocery store. I went through the motions. I wrote the thank you cards. I sorted his clothes. The smell of his Old Spice aftershave clinging to the fabric making my chest ache. I tried to find a new routine, but it was like trying to learn to walk again. Every step was clumsy and uncertain. The loneliness was a sickness. I'd talk to myself, just to hear a voice. I'd leave the television on all day, not watching, just needing the background noise to keep the silence at bay. But the canned laughter and cheerful jingles of commercials felt like a mockery. They were sounds from a world I no longer belonged to. The idea came to me on a rainy Tuesday in November. I was doing what I'd spent countless hours doing, sorting through Arthur's things. He was a man of hobbies, a tinkerer. He had boxes of old radio equipment, wires, and vacuum tubes, and in a dusty footlocker in the back of his closet, I found his old reel-to-reel tape recorder. A heavy, beautiful Akai machine. He'd loved it. He used to record symphonies off the radio, convinced the sound quality was superior to vinyl. Tucked beside it was a stack of blank, sealed reel-to-reel tapes, and underneath those, a pile of old magazines. Popular Mechanics, National Geographic, and one that caught my eye, a thin, unassuming journal of parapsychology. I have no idea why Arthur had it. Maybe he'd picked it up at a yard sale. He was never a believer in any of that stuff. He was a nuts and bolts man. If you couldn't measure it with a caliper or test it with a voltmeter, it wasn't real. I thumbed through it, mostly out of boredom, and that's when I saw it. An article titled, "The Voices on the Tape." It was about a group of researchers, I think they were Latvian or Swedish, who claimed to have captured disembodied voices on audio recordings in soundproof rooms. They called it electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP. The theory was that spirits, or some form of consciousness, could manipulate electronic noise, impressing their own voices onto it. They could use the random sounds of static, the space between radio stations, as a kind of digital Ouija board. The article was dry, academic. It was full of talk about frequencies and audio artifacts. But one line jumped out at me. It said that the most common catalyst for this phenomenon seemed to be emotional energy. Grief, love, a desperate need to connect. A seed was planted. It was a crazy idea. A desperate, foolish, crazy idea. Arthur would have laughed, told me I was being sentimental. But Arthur wasn't here, and the silence was. That night, I cleaned the dust off the Akai machine. I found the manual, threaded a new tape through the spindles, and plugged in the microphone. The house was still. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle whir of the tape reels starting to turn. I sat in the living room, across from Arthur's empty chair. The microphone felt heavy and cold in my hand. "Arthur?" I started, my voice cracking. I felt like an idiot. "Arthur, honey, are you there? It's Helen. I miss you. If you can hear me, can you just say something? Anything?" I let the tape run for 10 minutes. The two black reels spun in the dim light. A silent, hypnotic dance. I said his name a few more times. I talked about my day. I told him the Millers next door had a new puppy. It felt like a one-sided prayer. When the 10 minutes were up, I stopped it, took a deep breath, and rewound the tape. My heart was pounding with a mixture of hope and embarrassment. I put on the big, padded headphones, just like Arthur used to do when he'd listen to his symphonies. I pressed play. I heard the sound of my own shaky voice, thin and pathetic, and underneath it, nothing. Just the gentle, consistent hiss of the blank tape. Static, a soft, rushing sound like a seashell held to the ear. I listened to the entire 10 minutes. Nothing. I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. This one laced with shame. Of course, it didn't work. It was a stupid article in a stupid magazine. I was a lonely woman talking to an empty room. I almost packed the machine away right then. But I didn't. The next night, I tried again. And the night after that, it became my new ritual. Every night, around 10 p.m., I would sit in the living room, turn on the Akai, and talk to my husband. It was, in a strange way, comforting, even if he wasn't answering. It felt less like screaming into the void. For 2 solid weeks, the result was the same. My voice, and the sound of static. I started to recognize the different textures of it. Sometimes it was a low rumble. Other times a high-pitched hiss. It was the sound of nothing. The first red flag, as they say, came on a Wednesday night during the 3rd week. It was so small, so insignificant, that I almost missed it entirely. I had just finished my usual 10-minute recording session. As I was rewinding the tape, I was listening intently, my ear almost pressed to the speaker. During the playback, right after I had asked, "Are you at peace, Arthur?" there was a dip in the static, a tiny little hiccup in the sound, and in that fraction of a second, I thought I heard something. A faint, breathy whisper. I stopped the tape, rewound it, played it again. Hiss, "Are you at peace, Arthur?" Hiss, and there it was again. A tiny click, and then a sound. It was so distorted, so buried in the noise. I couldn't be sure it was a word at all. It could have been a bird outside, or the house settling. It sounded vaguely like, "Here." My breath caught in my throat. I must have played that 1-second segment back 100 times. Here, or was it here? Or was it just a random spike in the audio? My grief-addled brain desperate to find a pattern in the chaos? I told myself it was nothing. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for hours. The sound replaying in my mind. Hiss, here, hiss. I was hooked. My nightly ritual now had a new intensity. I bought better microphones. I tinkered with the recording levels. I filled tape after tape. Most of it was still nothing. But then, it happened again. A few days later, I got another one. A single word, clearer this time. I had been telling Arthur about how I'd fixed the dripping kitchen faucet. Something he'd always meant to get to. "You'd be proud of me," I'd said. On the playback, buried deep in the static, was a man's voice. It wasn't my voice. It was a low, gravelly whisper. And it said, plain as day, "Good." I ripped the headphones off my head. My entire body went cold. It wasn't Arthur's voice. His was a smoother baritone. Even when he whispered, this voice was deeper, rougher, but it was a voice. A clear, undeniable voice that was not my own. I tried to rationalize it. A stray radio signal? A neighbor's CB radio bleeding through? It was the 70s. That kind of thing happened. But it had answered my question directly. The timing was too perfect. A part of me, the logical part that sounded a lot like Arthur, was screaming that this was dangerous and wrong. But a much larger part of me, the lonely, desperate part, didn't care whose voice it was. It was a voice. It was a response from the quiet. It was proof that I wasn't alone. So I leaned in. I ignored the small, cold knot of fear in my stomach. I told myself that the afterlife, or whatever this was, probably changed a person's voice. Of course he wouldn't sound exactly the same. The messages started coming more frequently after that. They were always single words. Fragmented, cold, lost, dark. My heart broke for him. I pictured him wandering, lost in some cold, dark place. "I'm here, Arthur," I'd say into the microphone. "I can hear you. You're not alone." And the voice would respond. Over days and weeks. "Helen." The first time I heard it say my name, I wept. It was a confirmation. It had to be him. Who else would know my name? I started a journal, logging the date, time, and every single word I captured. My EVP log. I called it. It felt scientific. It felt important. This is the part of the story where I have to be honest. I became obsessed. I stopped seeing my friends. I let the house get messy. My entire world shrank to that living room, to that Akai machine and its spinning reels. My life was lived in 10-minute recorded increments and the hours of painstaking listening that followed. The change was slow, so slow I didn't see it for what it was. The tone of the voice began to shift. It was no longer just sad and lost. It started to feel possessive. One night, I was sitting in my usual spot, and I felt a draft. I got up to check the window, making sure it was latched. When I played the tape back from that session, after my own voice said, "Just a second, honey, it's getting chilly," the whisper on the tape said, "window." It was just one word, but the context terrified me. It wasn't just hearing me anymore. It was watching me. I tried to brush it off, but the red flags were getting bigger, harder to ignore. I recorded a session where I was wearing a new blue dress. My first attempt to not live in drab morning clothes. The voice on the tape that night said 2 words, "Pretty blue." I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the dark, staring at the tape recorder as if it were a venomous snake. The joy and comfort I'd felt were curdling into a thick, creeping dread. The voice in my headphones was no longer the voice of a lost loved one. It was the voice of an intruder. The part of my brain that sounded like Arthur was no longer whispering. It was screaming, "What have you done, Helen? Who are you talking to?" The turning point, the moment the ice-cold dread became sheer terror, happened about 2 months into this whole ordeal. I had a photograph of Arthur and me on the mantelpiece. It was from our 25th anniversary. Just a year before he died. We were both smiling, happy. I picked it up during a recording session. "I miss this smile, Arthur," I whispered, my thumb tracing the outline of his face. "I miss you so much." I finished the recording and put on the headphones, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I expected to hear. Maybe, "Miss you too." Or maybe nothing. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. First, there was the hiss of the static. Then, a sound I had never heard before. A low, wet, guttural chuckle. It was a horrible, mocking sound. And then the voice, clearer and closer than it had ever been, spoke a full sentence. It said, "Arthur is gone." Arthur was weak. I threw the headphones to the floor as if they were on fire. I scrambled back from the machine, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It wasn't him. It had never been him. This whole time, I hadn't been comforting my husband's spirit. I had been feeding something else. Something horrible. And I had been feeding it with my grief. I wanted to stop. God, I wanted to smash that machine with a hammer and throw the pieces in the river. But a new, more insidious fear took hold. What if stopping made it angry? It knew my name. It knew what I was wearing. It was watching me from somewhere. From the static. From the quiet spaces in my house. I had invited it in. And I had no idea how to make it leave. My fear turned into a strange, terrifying kind of investigation. I had to know what it was. I started asking it questions. Who are you? What do you want? The answers were chilling and vague. To my question, who are you? The tape hissed back, hungry. To, what do you want? It whispered. Inside, the atmosphere in the house had changed. The silence I had once found so deafening now seemed preferable to the alternative. Now, the quiet felt charged, expectant. I'd walk into a room and the air would be ice cold. I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow that would vanish when I turned to look. The faint, fading scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco was completely gone now, replaced occasionally by a smell I couldn't place. It was a damp, earthy smell, like freshly turned soil or root cellar that hadn't been opened in a century. This thing, whatever it was getting stronger, and it was using me. It was using my hope, my love for Arthur, as a bridge. The final recording session is one that I have tried, with every fiber of my being, to forget, but it's burned into my memory. It was a stormy night. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window frames. I hadn't planned on recording. I was too scared. I had the machine turned off, the tapes locked away in their boxes. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when I heard it, a low hum coming from the living room. I walked slowly towards the doorway, My whole body tense. The Akai machine was on. Its power light was glowing red. The reels were spinning slowly, despite there being no tape threaded through them at all. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe, and then, a voice spoke, not from the headphones, which were lying on the floor, not even from the machine's built-in speaker. The voice came from the empty air right in front of me. It was that same deep, gravelly whisper, but it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was solid. It was real. I'm tired of the tape. Helen. A floorboard creaked in the hallway behind me. I spun around, my heart seizing in my chest. Nothing was there, just the dark, empty hall. The voice spoke again, this time from the corner of the ceiling. Open the door. What do you want from me? I cried out, my voice a strangled sob. This time, the voice came from directly behind me. A cold breath on the back of my neck. A body is a better house than a wire. That was it. That was the moment the paralysis broke. A primal, animal instinct took over. It wasn't a choice, it was a biological imperative. Flee. I didn't grab my purse. I didn't grab my keys. I ran to the front door, fumbled with the lock, and burst out into the raging storm. I ran down the driveway in my housecoat and slippers, the rain soaking me to the bone in seconds. I didn't stop at the street. I ran across the lawns of my neighbors, my lungs burning, not daring to look back at the little ranch house. I ended up at the Miller's house. The neighbors with the new puppy. I must have been a terrifying sight, pounding on their door at midnight, soaking wet and hysterical, screaming that something was in my house. They let me in, of course. They called the police. 2 officers showed up, a younger one and an older, world-weary sergeant. I tried to explain. I told them about a prowler, an intruder. I couldn't bring myself to say the truth. Who would believe me? They went over to my house with their big flashlights. I watched from the Miller's window as the beams cut through the darkness of my home, sweeping past the windows. They were in there for about 20 minutes. When they came back, their faces were a mixture of pity and annoyance. Ma'am, the older sergeant said, his voice gentle but firm. There's no one in there. All the doors and windows are locked from the inside, except for the front door you came out of. Nothing's been taken. Nothing's out of place. He paused. Your tape recorder was on, though, in the living room, making a bit of a racket. They offered to drive me to a relative's house. I had them take me to my sister's, an hour away. I never spent another night in that house. My sister and her husband handled everything. They put the house on the market. They packed up my things. I asked my brother-in-law, a stoic man who reminded me a little of Arthur, to do one thing for me. I told him I wanted him to get rid of the Akai tape recorder and all the tapes. I told him it was broken and held bad memories. He agreed. A week later he told me it was done. Threw it in the town dump. He said, thing was heavy as sin. But when I went to smash it up a bit, just for good measure, something was odd. Odd how? I asked, my blood running cold. Well, he said, scratching his chin, I took a sledgehammer to it, and when I cracked the casing open, the inside, it was full of dirt, like someone had packed it with damp soil and dead leaves. Must have been mice or something. I've lived a long life since then. I moved to a different state. I never remarried. I filled my life with noise. I have a television or radio playing in every room of my apartment. All the time. I can't stand the quiet. The silence is where things wait. The police report from that night simply says I was suffering from distress due to my husband's recent passing. A hallucination brought on by grief. For a long time, I tried to believe that myself. It's the sane explanation. It's the sensible one. Arthur would have wanted me to believe the sensible explanation. But there's one last part to this story. A part I've never told anyone. About 6 years ago, I was living in a small apartment complex. It was late on a summer night, and a thunderstorm, much like that final night in my old house, knocked the power out. The entire building went dark, and for the first time in decades, I was plunged into absolute, total silence. The emergency lights hadn't kicked on yet. There was no hum from the refrigerator, no drone from the television, no sound from the street, just the rain against the window and my own breathing. And in that profound, heavy silence, I heard it. It came from the darkest corner of my bedroom. There were no electronics on. There was no static to hide in. There was nothing for it to use. It was just a voice in the dark. The same deep, gravelly voice from the tapes. And all it said was one simple word: Helen.